I think it's interesting how we talk about how can we reduce our carbon footprint around the world. And one of the things that is not getting nearly enough criticism of the Biden administration, and this is the problem with, the neoliberalism of our corporate media, not just in the United States, but as the BBC, lots of different news organizations around the world. Not only is Biden not decreasing the military budget. He's increasing it this first year by another $20 billion while saying he's pulling us out of Afghanistan. I don't know about you, but that money's going somewhere and it's going to be spent on something. Is it an invasion war in Venezuela? I don't know. But they have 25%.
Stay tuned.
Yeah, they have 25% of the crude oil supply on the planet under their soil. And our country
we're
wants
displeased with them.
Very much so. And sanctions only hurt innocent working class people. They do not.
So
hurt
are you
rich
suggesting
people.
we'd be better off doing like a full-scale invasion of Venezuela? Is that what
How
you're
about
suggesting?
just leave them alone and reduce the military budget? But how do we
okay.
combat? Because that seems to me to be the hardest. The hardest bridge to cross for a lot of people is understanding just how detrimental it is that we have this runaway, out of control military spending in this country. And that's only what we see on paper, Nick. As I'm sure you know, there is trillions in unaccounted money that is also involved with the military that is not on the books.
Yeah, I mean, it's deeply embedded in the whole political system. And you could see that, there was one that there's, you had the withdrawal from, we don't know quite what kind of withdrawal it will be from Afghanistan, but that's really about it's a repositioning, and there is no attempt to actually scale back on the military industrial complex. And it's deeply embedded. It's deeply embedded in each, it was warned about by Eisenhower. He was a general himself. He knew back in the 60s as a president and as a former general how powerful it become then. It's only become even more powerful since. We had the end of the Cold War. There was hopes it would scale back, and yet military spending has more or less doubled. And it goes up regardless of which administration is in power, regardless of their particular tactics. And it's so deeply embedded in US politics and economics, so that the defense industry is, we have the kind of revolving doors going back and forth continuously between people who were in leading arms manufacturers, who then become secretaries of defense or assistant secretaries of defense, or just people in the defense department, and then going back out. We have the huge amount of money, and they are the biggest contributors to the congressional committees, the Senate committees. I just looked at the border industry, and many of them actually, interestingly, this is one of the things we're seeing, is many of the same military companies that provide the arms are also doing most of the border militarization that's happening on the borders. And they actually gave about $10 million in 2020 to strategic legislators. We're talking the Homeland Security Committee, we're talking the Appropriations Committee in both the Congress and the Senate. So they're very, very strategic. They make sure, and then of course we know that in every congressional district there is some kind of military base, so that there is always the shout of jobs. So they've also co-opted various of the kind of trade, some of the trade union sectors into that as well, so that any attempts to kind of scale back is really strategically hard to do. But I think we have to kind of go back to the time of, and kind of repick some of the energy up that really got mobilized around the Iraq War. We had a kind of unprecedented global movement that was built at that time. And now is a time to put it forward, and we need to make those connections with other issues. We've got big mobilizations now around climate, but they don't often enough talk about the military. Both the way that the military is looking as climate change as the next war that they need to fight, and therefore the excuse for more spending. And we know what that means. That means that the victims of climate change now become the threats, because they will be the ones moving. So we have to get the weapons to fight the victims of climate change, because they're now threats. So it will exacerbate the climate crisis. But it's also, as you said, it's really diverting huge amounts of resources. Just imagine that 750 billion going towards a massively scaled up Green New Deal. It would
Yeah.
transform the situation. And so we got to make those connections, and we've got to build the movements that bridge the peace, the environmental movements, the social justice movements together.
I would definitely say that the biggest issue, and what I think is a separate the where the rubber meets the road, so to speak, when Jen ran for the U.S. Congress against Debbie Wasserman Schultz. If you know anything about her, she happens to be probably one of the foremost of the pro-war Democrats that exist. She votes yes on every military intervention. She is a huge advocate for intervention, regime change in Venezuela, among other places, including Syria. I think when you really get down to it, I think it really just comes down to the hooks that the top military contractors in the U.S. and around the world have in our elected officials. 3 of her top contributors are Raytheon, General Dynamics, and I believe it's either Lockheed Martin or there's
Honeywell,
Boeing.
Oh, Boeing.
Honeywell. Yes, Honeywell is the other one. Excuse me.
All fun things.
And so I think that probably more than anything else is really. There's something to be said for the corporate versus non-corporate movement in electoral politics that's happening in this country. I don't think enough potential grassroots candidates lean in enough on these corporate representatives who are, if you want to talk about who they are completely captured by, it is the military industrial complex. And if you could talk on that, that would be great.
Yeah, I mean they're very much tied, and I think in terms of just the kind of corporate influence, it's partly the arms industry is kind of one of the key players that is really fueling this. And so I saw it here just with my own representative here in California. He's Garamendi, and they're very much they're bought into this, both the money stream and also the interests, and they believe. And they've also bought into some of the rhetoric, I think. It was noticeable that Biden, when he just had this virtual climate summit, the second part of his agenda was called climate security. And they're now using really the military to say that because it's a military threat, this is why we should have climate action. So they're kind of dovetailing now this idea that the military can be a kind of a progressive actor in this whole scheme, and I think that's very dangerous. And I think Democrats really need to call, progressive and left Democrats need to call this out, because I see too many just saying, okay, well, the military is it's good to have them on board. If we can advance things on climate change, then let's just embrace them. But without looking at how the military has always stood behind corporate interests. I think it's Thomas Friedman. It was one who has that famous quote that behind every McDonald's there is a I think it was, I forget which military company, there's a Raytheon or something like that.
Yeah.
But basically his argument was that if you want to have corporate freedom and corporate profits, then it has to be backed up with the fist, with the might, so that those two things run together, that corporate expansion and corporate profits depends on the military might, depends on the fists that behind it that compose the threats. And that's very much why we've seen the two things run together. Globally, we've had a huge expansion of corporate trade regimes which don't benefit people, either in the US or outside. They're about driving prices and profits, and they're about driving prices down, labor costs down, increasing profits. And at the same time, we've had a huge expansion of the military. Those two things very much run together. And it's very obvious that throughout this whole, that's really since the 90s, since the end of the Cold War, that kind of those two agendas have run both internationally and domestically. So we've had a huge rise in corporate profits here, huge rise in corporate power domestically, so much so that it's kind of created a kind of norm where you cannot challenge it, that anything that challenges the interests of profits must be is kind of anti-democratic. Anyone who poses that is seen as a threat. And at the same time, you've had this huge military-industrial complex emerge at the same time. So they're very much embedded together, and we have to kind of tackle them in that kind of integrated, systemic way.
Thanks for watching. If you want to support our mission to transform politics into service, please like this video, subscribe, follow us on social media, and consider joining our Patreon, where you'll get early access to our interviews as well as other exclusive content. Links are in the description. Peace out.